Not too long ago, we got a little thing called Mists of Pandaria Remix, aimed at being a new and exciting way to level in World of Warcraft. But that was before the War Within came out, which changed the entire dynamic of leveling. Mop Remix was enough of a success that Blizzard has already talked about the future of remixed content, but how is Mists of Pandaria leveling since the pre-patch? That's exactly the question I'm going to answer today, as I have made it my goal to level a character through every expansion. This is the third episode in the series, so some of you may already know the rules, but I will explain it briefly for those who don't. I'm going to break Mists of Pandaria leveling into 3 subcategories, giving each a rating before one final overall rating at the end. To start, I took a brand new allied race character and leveled them through nothing but quests in Pandaria, and I gotta say, I'm quite impressed with. Maybe it's all the monk training of finding inner peace, perhaps it's the beautiful atmosphere that the land of Pandaria creates, but my spirits are in a fantastic mood today. Something about spending time in Pandaria just gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling. Now, I did play some Remix when it came out, not a super amount of it, but enough that I actually spent about the same time in Remix as I just spent questing this week. Both times, the actual world of Pandaria has left a wonderful impression on me. There were other reasons that I stopped playing Remix, but that can be a video for another day. Today is all about retail Mists of Pandaria leveling. Let me sum it up for you. Wow. Pun fully intended and both meanings 100% intentional. The feeling I got leveling through Mists is exactly the reason why I play World of Warcraft. Outside of Remix, I had never played MoP or had any experience with its actual continent. I have done the dungeons, we'll get to that a bit later, but before this week I had never sat down to play through it as an experience. This is probably the most lukewarm take in the history of World of Warcraft, but this feels like what Battle of Azeroth was trying to do, but so much better. The faction war, the new lands with interesting allies, the old god threat that gets unleashed as a result of our fighting. I don't know if it was Blizzard's intention to take the story beats from Mists of Pandaria and use them for BFA, but they didn't do a very good job of it. I'll have to take another look at BFA when it becomes its turn in this series, but dang does Mists do this premise very well. Questing through MoP just feels great. It makes me feel great, the quests and the gearing feels great, the zones, the world, the atmosphere. So far, my favorite part of doing this series is getting to see how World of Warcraft has evolved expansion to expansion. I skipped Cataclysm for the moment because I got multiple requests to do MoP, also because I'm still deciding how I want to do Cata, but it honestly doesn't feel like Mists skips much of a beat. I want to emphasize the word feel there, as there are definitely some differences, but nothing that stands out as a big jump. I didn't hop into Pandaria and go, whoa, this feels pretty foreign. Well, I mean, I'm a Westerner, so yeah, it kinda did, but you get what I mean. From the conversations I've seen online, Mists is considered the start of the real modernization of World of Warcraft. After questing through it, I am realizing that may have nothing to do with the actual quests and the world itself. Keep in mind, Mists of Pandaria is when the talents took a radical change. Challenge modes, an entire daily island, the introduction of systems like the black market, all these things came out in this expansion. But when leveling through it using Chromie time, the talents are back to the trees, you don't have any challenges to do, and you certainly don't do any shady dealings that involve millions of gold. What you do is experience a world that feels lived in. Help your new allies, defeat ancient evils, grow in power and as a person, meet mystical dragons, fight the opposing faction for a foothold, and watch as your journey fleshes out the world. Sound familiar? Yeah, it really is ironic that the best compliment I can give MoP is that it has balance. That's like the entire premise of its story, finding balance in oneself. Let me explain what I mean. There are quests that give you a choice of gear rewards, which include stuff tailor-made to your spec, and then there are quests that show you 5 weapons and say, hey, just take all of them. You'll find a use for them eventually, I'm sure. There's a quest where you have to pick plants from the ground to help a local farmer, and then you run into an elite that is marked on the map that gives guaranteed gear. It's a combination of grounded questing with more modern features like marked elites. Gearing that has you pick your reward, but also makes sure that you get enough gear to have the option of flexibility in what spec you want to level with. Maybe you want to quest as DPS and queue dungeons as a healer. Perfect, you have the tools to do that. I also would like to point out that if you are a collector, this is a great way to stock up on toys. In my leveling, I added like 10 or 15 new toys to my collection without even going out of my way to get them. A decent bit of the quests give them as rewards. Alright, everything is great so far. What about the times? I quested through Mop with no heirlooms or dungeons in about 9 hours, a pretty decent pace for only questing. To do so, I only used 3 out of the 7 zones to basically completion. There were a few quests left in the summits, but other than that, I completed every main and side quest in the Jade Forest, the Valley of the Four Winds, and the Kunlai summits. Now, what is different from the last 2 expansions we tested is the actual main story quests. I personally chose to go the completionist route where I did every quest I could, but if you were looking for a more structured playthrough of mob questing, you can just follow the main story. You'll be level 70, if not close to it, by the end of it, I'd reckon. Especially if, unlike me, you do the dungeons that the main story leads you to, but as you can tell, it's not needed. Some of you may know it by now, so say it with me. Player choice is king. But what about my choice for rating the questing experience in Mists of Pandaria? There's no surprise here. It's a pretty solid 9 out of 10. I am very hesitant to give anything a perfect score, especially as there were some issues. One of which stems from one of the strengths actually. If you are doing the main story, there are a decent amount of RP quests, where you have to sit through dialogue or ride through the air on a dragon, which is undoubtedly cool, but it is not everyone's cup of tea. However, if that's the main criticism I can throw at mop questing, the 9 out of 10 is well deserved. It's fast, it's enjoyable, and it's a beautiful world to level in. And if you find this video enjoyable, make sure to hit that like button, it would be much appreciated. Let's see if Mists of Pandaria can keep its goodness going with rating the dungeons of Mists of Pandaria is going to be one of the most interesting in the entire series. I'm just going to call that right now, because I had to actually do a bit of research for this one. There are 9 dungeons that were released during the expansion, but in actuality, Pandaria only has 6 of them, which is the lowest out of all expansions. The next lowest is Warlords of Draenor, which has 1 or 2 more than Mists of Pandaria. Let me just put this into perspective. There are almost more raids released in Mists than there were dungeons to do. In fact, the amount of raid bosses in Mists of Pandaria is almost double the amount of dungeon bosses. It is more than double if you include all the world bosses out there. While the Scarlet Monastery dungeons and Skullomance did get revamps in Mists of Pandaria, they're actually not a part of the random dungeon queue for it. In fact, there are only 5 dungeons that are actually a part of the leveling queue because Siege of Niazao Temple is a heroic only dungeon. So what does that mean for your dungeon experience? For one, if you really like these 5 dungeons, you're gonna have a blast. None of them are super long, the highest boss count is tied at 4, and the pathing in them, well, it has some pros and cons. None of them have what I would call a normal route, which will likely be a theme more and more as we get into the later expansions. Each of them has something quirky about them in terms of how you move around the dungeon to complete it. In my eyes, it's really a double-edged sword. With only 5 of them to do, that can get stale pretty quickly, so having interesting dungeons will spice that up a bit. Look at the Temple of the Jade Serpent. You can run that dungeon in many ways, some of them dumber than others, but you could do it. Storm Stout Brewery has some fun little bosses. Gate of the Setting Sun is all about defending a wall from a giant siege, so while there are only 5 of them, the actual variety between them is impressive despite the low numbers. That being said, part of the issue is because said variety comes at a cost. For example, the Gate dungeon has some of the most complicated pathing of any instance in the game. When I first did it, I was like, oh, we're just fighting on a wall? Simple enough. Then we got to the towers on the wall. Let's just say I've seen more than a few people get left behind due to them getting lost on where to go and when. When I started this series, I didn't think that deciding some of these ratings was going to be so difficult. In all honesty, it makes me excited for the final episode where I go back and rank everything. But for now, I'm going to put the dungeon experience of Mists of Pandaria at a respectable 7 out of 10. There could be an entire professional debate on the pros and cons of its dungeon list. Is having only 5 dungeons good? Is there wide variety and sometimes complexity good? In the end, I can comfortably say that I enjoy running these dungeons. They do take some learning, but having only 5 of them means that it's not that much learning overall. Right now, it really feels like a philosophical debate is going on in my head. To avoid becoming the living embodiment of a particular statue, let's swiftly move on to I'm just gonna bite the bullet and call this section the gearing experience from here on out, because in the end, that's the biggest factor on the rating of it. How well will the gear carry you into current content? Thankfully, this is the most quantifiable section of the video. As always, the goal is item level 350 by the end of getting to level 70. So how close did I get? I got to item level 327. Pretty good, only 23 off, but boy was it not looking good until the very end. For those who don't know, item level is an average. It takes the score of your entire gear into consideration. Towards the end of leveling, I had a few key pieces that were lagging behind the rest of my gear, in particular, my pants. It wasn't until the very last quest that I found a good upgrade for them. Talk about the luck. I turned a pair of item level 158 pants into a pair that is now my highest item level. The difference in my overall score is 314 with the old pair and 327 with the new pair. One piece made a 13 item level difference towards that 350 goal, and it's something I really should have brought up in the past, but the item level of the gear you get entirely depends on what level your character is when you get it. So if you really want to be sweaty about it, you could save a quest that gives you a weapon until level 69 and turn it in then. But considering this is a general info video, I did not go out of my way to do that. 327 isn't the best I've seen, but it's also certainly not the worst. If any expansion gives me a 350, that might be a perfect 10 out of 10. Also keep in mind, this character didn't do any dungeons. Maybe in one of those dungeons, I might have gotten a new helmet to replace the 236 I have. But remember when I said Mists of Pandaria is doing a great job at finding a balance? Well, that is still true in this section. Not the best item level, not the worst. It is the most amount of gold I've gained, but also the least amount of bags I got. But at the same time, it did give me the biggest bag so far in the form of a 24 slaughter, which is honestly big enough to not have to replace. The best you can get on the auction house for cheap is a 32 slot bag, so it's really up to you to decide how much gold 8 slots is worth. I will say that if you are planning to level through mob, send some gold or bags over when you begin. The frequency in which I had to clear my inventory because I didn't get any bags was slightly annoying. Even the 24 slot bag came from a side quest in the Kunlai Summits, which was decently into my journey. Overall, I'm going to give the gearing experience an 8 out of 10. It gets you within range of a few upgrades getting you to that 350 mark, and along with that, it gives you a decent amount of gold while doing it. Still not a crazy amount, but 6,000 gold is nothing to scoff at when your primary goal is leveling a character. Which brings me to the final section. I really enjoyed my time in Mists of Pandaria. It's a beautiful content with a fun story and just as fun quests. There aren't many dungeons, but there are some interesting ones at the very least. So far, it has been the most balanced experience of good and pleasant things. I'm going to give Mists of Pandaria an overall rating of 8 out of 10. I considered giving it an 8.5, but I'm not too sure I want a 0.5 in the final rating. It's more okay for a subsection, and I usually only give it when I'm feeling bad about a low rating, so an 8 out of 10 is where it's going. If you're looking for a good expansion to quest and queue dungeons at the same time, Mists of Pandaria is a great candidate for that. I'm curious to see if it'll hold the most well-balanced title by the end of this series. But now I have a question for all of you still watching. Thank you so much, by the way. It means a lot. The support on this series has been absolutely amazing. But how do you think I should approach Cataclysm? It is by far the most diverse of Chromie times, 2 different giant continents, 2 different sets of dungeons. Whatever ideas you have for that, let me know. I'll give it a real thinker. But in the meantime, next week's is going to be Warlords of Draenor, touted as the best leveling expansion by a decent amount of the guides I've seen. We'll have to put that to the test. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit that like button. If you want to see how Wrath of the Lich King compares to Mists of Pandaria, click the video on the right. My name has been Kale, and have a very good journey.